If you find meaning in stories told from the ground up, from the hands that built history rather than the names that ordered it, then Another POV may be worth your time. Consider subscribing and let these perspectives find you. Before the sun fully clears the eastern ridge of the desert, the air already carries the smell of it, that particular mineral dryness, powdery and faintly mineral, like the inside of a stone that has never seen rain. You notice it the moment you wake. It settles in the back of your throat before you have spoken a single word. It is not unpleasant exactly. It is simply the smell of where you are, and after enough weeks you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. You are lying on a reed mat inside a mud brick structure that is barely tall enough to stand upright in. The walls are thick enough to hold back some of the heat, and the ceiling is low, supported by rough wooden beams dragged in from somewhere along the river. You share this space with 5 other men. Their breath fills the small room. One of them is already sitting up, adjusting the linen wrap around his waist, the fabric a dingy off-white that was probably cleaner when it was issued. You don't speak yet. There is no need. The morning has its own language, and everyone here has learned it. Outside, across the packed earth paths that run between the rows of similar structures, the settlement is already beginning to stir. You can hear it, the low murmur of men rising, the occasional clatter of a ceramic vessel, the creak of a wooden door swung open on its pivot stone. Somewhere to the north, a fire has been lit in one of the larger open-air kitchens, and within minutes, the smell of bread baking on hot stone has found its way to you, threading through the dry mineral air with something almost like warmth in it. This is Hayt el Ghurab, the settlement the workers call many things in casual speech, but which the administrators have organized with the precision of everything else here. It sits at the edge of the plateau's lower margin, close enough to the construction work that the sound of chisels carries on still mornings, far enough that the dust from the cutting yards doesn't coat everything you eat. The buildings are neat, arranged in rows, their placement deliberate. Nothing here is accidental. Even the angle of the sleeping quarters has been considered, oriented to catch the prevailing north breeze and deflect the worst of the midday heat. Whoever planned this settlement understood that exhausted, sick workers could not haul stone. You rise and fold the mat against the wall. Your back registers the night's labor before your mind does. A low, familiar ache across the shoulders and the base of the spine that never fully disappears now, only softens on rest days and sharpens on long, pulling days. You have been here for most of this flood season, nearly 2 months now. You arrived with 63 men from the agricultural villages along the Middle Nile, conscripted into the rotating labor organization when the floodwaters made farming impossible. Back home, your fields are submerged. Here you haul stone. You step outside into the grey-pink light of early morning. The plateau stretches out to the west, its pale limestone surface catching the first light in a way that makes it look almost warm. In the near distance, you can see the lower courses of the structure already rising, massive, geometrically exact, tier upon tier of cut limestone that seems to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. Even now, after weeks in its shadow, the scale of it stops you for a moment. Not out of wonder, or not only out of wonder, but out of a kind of involuntary recalibration. The mind keeps expecting it to resolve into something comprehensible, and it keeps failing. It is simply too large to hold as a single thought. Other men pass you on the path, moving toward the eastern end of the settlement where the morning meal is distributed. You fall in with them naturally, shoulder to shoulder. You know most of their faces now, even those from groups other than your own. The labor organization here divides everyone into named gangs, small divisions within larger crews, each with its own identity, its own competitive pride. Your group carries a name that references the pharaoh, as they all do, a title that connects ordinary men pulling ropes to the divine commission above them. Whether the men believe that connection deeply or simply wear the name as a kind of belonging, it is difficult to say. Probably both things are true at once. The distribution area is a long open space, bordered on one side by storage magazines. Low rectangular buildings, whose interiors you have glimpsed only briefly, stacked with round-bottomed bread pots and sealed ceramic jars. The administrators who manage the food supply work from papyrus records, their lists meticulous and constantly updated. This is not charity or improvisation. This is a state mechanism, functioning with the same deliberate precision as the quarrying schedule, the tool distribution, the roster of who is assigned to which section of ramp on which day. You receive your share alongside the others, several round loaves, still warm enough that the heat moves through the linen when you press them against your chest. There is also dried fish, a small amount, salted and hard at the edges, and a cup of thick beer, dark and yeasty, issued from large ceramic vessels that have been carried up from the brewing facilities further back in the settlement. The beer is not luxury. It is caloric weight, issued alongside bread, because both together provide what sustained physical labor requires. You eat standing, the way almost everyone does in the morning, watching the light change over the plateau. The bread is coarse. You have noticed traces of grit in it before, not from carelessness, but from the grinding process itself, stone against stone, leaving its residue in the flour. Over weeks, this wears on the teeth. The older men among the workers carry that mark in their mouths, but the bread is substantial, and there is enough of it, and this distinguishes your situation from the thin margins of a poor harvest back home, where a man might enter the planting season already hollowed out by winter. Here at least the food comes with regularity. Around you the morning organizes itself with practiced speed. Team leaders move through the eating area, counting heads, checking against their lists. Scribes stand nearby with pallets and their rolls of papyrus, recording what arrives, what is issued, who is present and who is not. Everything is noted. A man sick with a gut ailment was pulled from the hauling roster yesterday and assigned to lighter work near the settling basin. The scribes recorded that too. The medical oversight here is practical rather than compassionate in any modern sense, but it exists and it functions. A worker who collapses from heat or injury and cannot be returned to use within a day or two is a problem to be managed, not simply abandoned. You finish the last of the beer, set the cup down in the collection area, and turn toward the northwest where the ramp begins its long ascent. The morning briefing for your gang will happen at the base of the main hauling run, where the overseer, a compact, weathered man who communicates mostly through positioning and hand signals above the noise, will indicate which course you are working today and what the day's haul target is. The sky overhead has moved from grey-pink to a flat, saturated blue. There are no clouds. There are never clouds. The stone dust is already rising somewhere ahead of you, catching the early light, drifting south on the thin morning wind like pale smoke. The ramp is not a single thing. That is the first misunderstanding a new arrival carries with him, usually for his first week before the scale of the operation corrects it. You imagined, before you came, something like a steep hill of packed earth leading straight to the top. What you found instead is a system, a layered branching infrastructure of compacted fill, mud brick retaining walls, limestone chip surfacing, and wooden support elements that has grown alongside the structure it serves. It changes as the structure rises. The overseers and the architects who carry the papyrus plans argue constantly at its edges, adjusting angles, ordering fill brought forward or cut back. The ramp is as much a construction project as the monument itself. Your gang assembles at the base of the main hauling run as the sun clears the horizon entirely and the plateau loses its brief ambiguity of color and becomes simply white and bright. The overseer is already there, standing with two team leaders and a younger scribe who is recording something with quick practice strokes. There is no formal address. The overseer points, two gestures indicating the course level and the direction of haul, and that is sufficient. The men adjust their positions, take up the ropes, and the day begins. The block you are assigned to move today is local limestone, quarried from the plateau itself, which is both the most abundant material here and the most brutal to work with in direct sun. Its surface, freshly cut, has not yet had time to develop the pale skin of oxidation, and it reflects the morning light with an almost aggressive brightness. It weighs somewhere between 2 and 3 tons. You cannot know precisely, but you have developed an instinct for it over weeks of hauling. The way the sledge resists your first pull, the particular vibration that travels up the rope into your palms and forearms when the weight begins to move. The sledge itself is a low wooden platform, reinforced with lashings of twisted fiber rope, its runners worn smooth from months of use. Before the haul begins, a man moves ahead with a skin of water, pouring a thin stream onto the surface in front of the runners. The water darkens the stone dust instantly and changes the character of the surface beneath, reducing the resistance enough that a crew of your size can keep the sledge moving without the kind of stall that costs time and risks injury. It is a small and precise intervention, and it must be timed correctly. Too far ahead, and the wet strip dries before the sledge reaches it. Too close, and the water does not fully penetrate the dust layer. The man doing it has done it so many times that he adjusts almost without thinking, reading the pace of the haul and the dryness of the air simultaneously. You are in the middle section of the rope. The front pullers set the pace and the angle. Your role in the middle is to sustain momentum, to absorb the micro-fluctuations in resistance without breaking the collective rhythm. In the back, a smaller group uses short wooden levers to assist the rear of the sledge over uneven patches in the ramp surface. The coordination required is not complicated in concept, but it demands sustained attention, because a single man losing his footing or releasing tension at the wrong moment sends a shock through the whole system that can stall the sledge or worse. The overseer's assistant walks alongside the haul, maintaining the cadence. He calls out a rhythmic phrase, the same phrase repeated, and the crew pulls in unison on the accented beat. The sound is not musical in any aesthetic sense, but it functions as music functions. It places everyone in the same moment, the same breath, the same application of force. After a time, you stop hearing the words and simply feel the rhythm through your body, the pull synchronized with something below conscious thought. The rope is rough against your palms. The blisters from your first weeks have long since hardened into callus, and the callus itself has begun to split at the creases, the skin cracking in the dry air. You wrap the rope slightly differently on the worst days. The ramp surface rises at a gradient that is shallow enough for the sledge to be moved, but steep enough that stopping mid-haul is almost never done by choice. The limestone chip paving that covers the ramp's mud brick fill is irregular in places, repaired in sections with fresh material that has not yet compacted to the same hardness as the older surface. Your feet learn these variations. You know where the surface gives slightly underfoot, where a wooden beam is buried just below the surface to prevent a section from slumping, where a patch of loose chipping was laid too recently and spreads under pressure. None of this knowledge was taught to you explicitly. It accumulated through repetition, through small physical failures corrected over days and weeks. The sun is well up by the time you reach the delivery point. Your arms and shoulders are burning in the way that is neither pain nor not pain, a deep, pressurized heat that settles into the muscle and stays there until the rest period. The block is guided off the sledge by a separate crew of positioning specialists who work at the course level, skilled men who do not haul, but who are responsible for fitting each block precisely into its designated space. They use wooden levers and small rocking motions to nudge the stone into alignment, checking with instruments you do not fully understand. Plumb bobs, set squares of wood and string, reference lines marked in charcoal on the surface of adjoining blocks. One of them notices a slight imperfection in the previous block's outer face and calls a stonemason forward. The mason examines it briefly, selects a copper chisel from the roll of tools beside him, and makes 3 careful cuts. The sound of the chisel on limestone carries clearly in the dry air, a clean, sharp knock, slightly different in tone from the broader pounding of the extraction crews below. You descend the ramp with the empty sledge. Going down is easier on the muscles but harder on the knees, and the men who have been doing this for multiple flood seasons carry that history in the way they step. Slightly wide-footed, careful on the transitions, resting weight on the uphill leg whenever the gradient increases. The sledge is controlled on the descent by ropes held back against the load, 2 men walking backward, bracing against the tendency of the empty platform to slide forward on its runners. At the base, you pause in the shadow of a limestone retaining wall, while the next block is positioned on the sledge for the following haul. The shadow is real, but not cool. The wall itself has absorbed 3 hours of morning sun and radiates it back at close range. Still, the direct sun is the difference between endurance and something worse, and you press against the shade without ceremony, drinking from a pottery jar that a water carrier has left at the rest point. The water is warm, slightly brackish, carried from cisterns fed by a canal that runs from the direction of the river. It is not pleasant water by any measure, but the body's need for it overrides preference entirely by mid-morning. Around you, the construction site is fully alive in a way that is almost impossible to isolate into individual details. Hauling crews work multiple ramps simultaneously. You can see the ropes stretching at angles across the lower courses, the distant rhythmic motion of crews moving blocks on other sections. From somewhere to the east, the extraction quarry sends a continuous low percussion upward. Hammers, wedges, the occasional deep report of a large stone being pried free. On the plateau surface to the south, a line of workers is moving material that is not block, mud brick for ramp repair, or possibly fill for a leveling project, carrying it in woven baskets on wooden shoulder yokes. The scribes are everywhere at the margins, their records constant, their presence unremarked upon by anyone. You look upward, as you do sometimes during rest moments, at the rising courses above you. The structure is not finished. There are sections where the outer facing is still rough core limestone awaiting its polished white casing, but where the casing has been applied on the lower completed courses, it catches the high sun and throws it back with a brightness that is almost painful to look at directly. The angle of each casing stone has been cut with a precision that makes the transition between them nearly invisible at distance. This work was done by men not very different from you, men with rope calluses and cracked hands, and a familiarity with limestone dust in their throats, but working at a different register of skill, with accumulated knowledge that takes years rather than weeks to build. The overseer's assistant moves along the rest line and begins calling the crews back to position. The next block is ready on the sledge. The water carrier has collected the jars. The shadow of the retaining wall is already shorter than it was when you stepped into it, the sun pressing westward across the sky with its indifferent constancy. You take up the rope again. The midday rest is not announced so much as arrived at, a gradual slowing of the hauling rhythm as the sun reaches its highest position, and the overseer makes the gesture that releases the crews from the ramp. The change moves through the site quickly, the way a shift in wind moves through tall grass, each section responding to the one beside it, until the whole operation has settled into a different register. The percussion from the quarry does not stop entirely. The extraction crews work on a separate rotation, but the hauling lines go still and the ramps empty of their moving weight, and for a period of perhaps 2 hours, the construction site exhales. You follow your gang to the midday distribution point, a covered area of reed matting stretched between wooden posts that provides shade without walls, open to whatever breeze moves across the plateau. The food here is heavier than the morning issue, more bread, a portion of dried or salted fish, and on some days a small amount of meat, typically beef or goat, distributed in portions that reflect the rationing records the scribes maintain. The presence of meat surprises people when they first arrive. Back in the agricultural villages, meat appears at festivals, at the conclusion of a successful harvest, at weddings or funerals. It is not ordinary food. Here, it is issued because the administrators understand, in practical rather than nutritional terms, what happens to a hauling crew that is running on bread and water alone after 6 weeks of sustained work? The animals that provide it are brought to the site in numbers, slaughtered and processed in the settlement's preparation areas, and distributed according to crew size and work classification. Senior craftsmen and specialists receive larger portions. The hauling gangs receive less, but they receive something. You sit cross-legged on the ground beside 2 men from your division, one from a village 2 days upriver from yours, one from a place so far south that his dialect requires concentration to follow. In the first weeks, conversation between the gangs was limited and careful, the way it is between strangers sharing unfamiliar proximity. Now the boundaries have softened. You know the upriver man's name, know that he has a wife and 2 daughters, and a small plot of emmer wheat that he worries about in the way all farmers worry, a background current of anxiety about soil and water that never fully quiets. The southern man is quieter by nature, but he has a habit of carving small figures from limestone chips during rest periods, rough animal shapes, a dog, a seated person, which he gives away without apparent sentiment when someone admires them. You eat without hurrying. This is one of the things the midday rest teaches over time, the value of not rushing through the pause, of allowing the body to actually recover rather than simply stopping. In the early weeks, you spent rest periods in a kind of suspended anxiety, already anticipating the return to the ropes. Now you understand that the hours between hauls are not wasted time, but structural time, as necessary to the system as the hauling itself. A crew that returns to the ropes after genuine rest moves stone more efficiently than one that never fully stopped. The administrators seem to understand this. The rest is protected. Overseers do not typically pull men back early except in exceptional circumstances. The southern man is working on something new, a shape that might be a seated figure or might be a crocodile. It is too early to tell. His hands move with the small copper pick in a way that requires no apparent thought, the motion absorbed into some part of him that operates below decision. You watch him briefly, then look out past the shade structure toward the western edge of the plateau, where the desert extends without interruption to a horizon that offers nothing back. The landscape around Giza is not empty in the way that the word desert implies emptiness. The plateau itself has been worked, leveled and cut and organized over years of preparation before the monument's first courses were laid. You can still see, in certain light conditions, the evidence of that initial leveling. The straight lines of bedrock exposed where the surface was dressed flat, the shadows of ancient cut lines that mark where the engineers established their datum plane, the reference level from which all heights were measured. These lines were not incidental. The plateau had to be made into an instrument of precision before a single building stone was placed, and the work of making it so was its own enormous undertaking, accomplished by men who are not here anymore and whose names are not recorded anywhere you would ever encounter them. To the east, partially visible from where you are sitting, the canal terminus operates in its slow, continuous way. The Nile's flood season is the reason you are here and the reason the logistics of the site function at all. The river, swollen and silt-laden, has pushed water into secondary channels and deliberately managed basins that bring boats carrying stone from distant quarries within practical distance of the plateau. From Tura, across the river and slightly south, the fine white limestone that will eventually clad the outer surface arrives by boat, pale and close-grained in a way that the local plateau stone is not. From Aswan, 800 kilometers upriver, the red granite that lines the interior chambers comes on long wooden vessels, the stone's weight riding low in the water during the high flood period when the river has depth enough to carry it. The logistics of this transport are staggering to contemplate, but contemplation is not required of you. You experience only its downstream result, the constant arrival of material, the scribes recording deliveries, the blocks moving from water to sledge to ramp, with a regularity that suggests the planning behind it has absorbed every variable. What you do understand, because it affects your daily experience, is the relationship between the flood season and your own presence here. The Nile's rise and fall is not merely a calendar event, but an organizing principle. The state draws its rotating labor from agricultural communities precisely because the flood makes those communities temporarily available. Their fields are underwater, their primary occupation suspended, and their bodies are the resource the construction project requires. This is not understood by the men in your gang as exploitation in any conscious political sense. It is simply the shape of obligation within a world ordered by the pharaoh's authority and the cosmic framework that authority represents. The king builds for eternity. The building requires work. The work requires you. These propositions connect in a chain that does not invite examination at the level you are living it. And yet the connection to something larger than daily labor is not entirely absent from ordinary experience. In the evenings, when the light drops below the plateau's edge and the construction site loses its harsh daytime clarity, there are moments when the structure's emerging form communicates something beyond its own mass. It is not precisely religious feeling, or not only that, it is something more physical, a recognition that you are embedded in an undertaking whose scale exceeds any individual life, any single flood season, any particular gang's contribution. The men who laid the courses now buried beneath your work are gone. The men who will lay the courses above the point the structure has currently reached have not yet arrived from their villages. The work continues regardless, passing through human bodies the way river water passes through channels, the flow persisting beyond any single vessel. After the midday rest, the afternoon hauls are harder in some ways and easier in others. Harder because the sun is now from the west and lower, throwing long shadows across the ramp in ways that complicate footing and make the surface transitions more difficult to read. Easier because the air temperature begins its slow descent from the peak, and the body, having rested, moves with more confidence. The afternoon halls are also when the craftsmen on the upper courses do their most precise work. The light at a lower angle reveals surface irregularities that the high noon sun washes flat, and the masons use this quality of light deliberately, running their hands across cut faces to feel what the eye might miss. You make 3 more halls before the day's work concludes. The third is the most difficult, a larger block, redirected to your gang from another crew whose team leader reported a man with a leg injury. And by the time it reaches the delivery point, your shoulders have moved past the deep burn and into a kind of neutrality that is either numbness or exhaustion, too complete for sensation. You do not speak during the descent. None of the men do. The conversation, such as it is, happens later. The site empties in the late afternoon, with the same graduated rhythm that characterized the midday rest, each section releasing in sequence until the ramps are still, and the plateau holds only the dust settling out of the air and the long shadows of the construction reaching eastward across the stone. The structure stands in the raking light with absolute patience. It will be here when the dust has settled. It will be here when the last crew has walked back down to the settlement and eaten their evening bread and lain down on their mats. It has no relationship to the urgency that moves through human bodies during the hours of work. It simply receives what is given to it and rises, course by course, toward whatever the architects have drawn on their papyrus plans as the eventual apex. You walk back toward the settlement with the others, your shadow preceding you in the long afternoon light, stretching out across the pale plateau stone until it reaches the edge and disappears into the distance below. The evenings at the settlement have a texture quite different from the days. Something releases in the air when the work stops. Not quite relaxation, because the body's accumulated fatigue does not resolve quickly enough for anything so complete, but a loosening of the particular alertness that hauling requires. The constant reading of surfaces, rope tensions, the overseer's gestures, the movements of the men around you, all of that vigilance unwinds slowly over the first hour after the return from the plateau, like a rope left coiled too long that takes time to find its own slack. The evening meal is distributed from the same kitchen area as the morning, but the atmosphere around it is different. Men sit longer. The conversations that were impossible during the day's noise, the constant percussion of the quarry, the cadence calls of the hauling lines, the general dense sound of a large workforce in motion, become possible again. You eat your bread and your portion of dried fish, and you listen as much as you speak, because the range of men gathered here from across the Nile's agricultural communities means that any evening carries fragments of a geography much larger than your own experience of it. The man from upriver talks tonight about the inundation back home, the specific quality of the water this year, whether the color and sediment content suggest a fertile deposit or a thin one. What the old men in his village read into the river's behavior in the weeks before the rise. Farmers read the Nile the way scribes read papyrus, in a language of signs developed over generations and transmitted not through formal instruction, but through proximity and repetition. A son standing beside his father at the water's edge year after year until the reading becomes instinct. He speaks about it with the kind of authority that only comes from genuine anxiety, the assessment not academic but personal, tied to the specific plot of ground his family's survival depends upon. The southern man says little as usual, but he has finished his carved figure. It resolved into a seated person after all, knees drawn up, arms resting forward, the posture of someone waiting without impatience. He turns it in the firelight for a moment, examining his own work with a critical neutrality, then sets it down between the food vessels without ceremony. You pick it up briefly and feel the cool weight of it, the small irregularities where the pick left its marks. The limestone is local plateau stone, pale and slightly gritty. In a few hundred years, if it survives, it will be indistinguishable in material from the blocks stacked above you on the construction site. For now, it is a seated figure, anonymous and patient, looking at nothing. The fires in the settlement are small and practical, for warmth in the hours after sunset. when the desert releases its stored heat upward with startling speed, and the temperature drops to a level that surprises anyone who has only experienced the Giza plateau in daylight. The desert's thermal logic is absolute and indifferent. What it absorbs during the day, it surrenders at night, and the body that was grateful for shade at noon is by the second hour after sunset pressing toward whatever heat source is available. You wrap the linen more closely and shift your position relative to the fire without thinking about it, the adjustment automatic. Throughout the settlement's perimeter, the administrative buildings continue their quieter work after the hauling has stopped. The scribes who record the day's deliveries complete their tallies by lamplight, the small flames of their oil lamps visible through the doorways as yellow points in the general blue-gray of the evening. These men occupy a different stratum of the labor organization than you do, educated, literate, connected to the apparatus of state administration in ways that extend beyond this particular project and this particular season. They do not haul stone, their bodies do not carry the same accumulated damage, but they are not idle, and the precision of their records is as essential to the project's functioning as the strength of any hauling crew. A delivery of granite blocks incorrectly tallied, a crew roster with errors that go uncorrected, a material allocation that loses track of where the fine Tura limestone has been directed. Any of these failures ripples outward through the system in ways that cost days of work for hundreds of men. You have had limited direct interaction with the scribes, but you have watched them enough to understand something of their world. They move through the construction site with a different quality of attention than the hauling crews. Observational rather than physical, cataloging rather than straining. Their instruments are simple: a wooden pallet, reed brushes, cakes of black and red pigment, rolled papyrus. But the system they maintain is vast. Every gang is named and numbered. Every block that passes through the delivery points is recorded. The boats arriving at the canal terminus are logged with their cargo, their origin, the name of the crew that transported them. The administrator who oversees the entire supply chain for the Tura limestone, a man named in a papyrus logbook whose existence you could not know, keeps a record so detailed that future readers will be able to reconstruct individual days of transport across the gap of thousands of years. You do not know this. You know only the small rectangle of the daily roster on which your gang's name appears, confirmed present each morning before the hauls begin. There is a medical facility in the settlement. Several rooms staffed by men whose role combines practical wound treatment with the ritual elements that ancient Egyptian medicine does not cleanly separate from physical intervention. Injuries on a construction site of this scale are inevitable, and the range of what the medical staff encounters reflects the full spectrum of what heavy labor and sharp stone produce: cuts from copper tools, crushing injuries from blocks that shift unexpectedly during positioning, heat exhaustion in its various degrees, fractures from falls on the ramp surface, infections developing in wounds that the dust environment complicates. The men who treat these injuries work empirically, with knowledge accumulated through practice rather than theory, and their success rate is variable in ways that the settlement's records reflect with quiet frankness. Some men return to work, some assigned to lighter duties indefinitely, some who do not appear in subsequent rosters. You have visited the medical area twice, once for a rope burn that became infected along the palm, treated with a poultice of what smelled like honey mixed with something resinous, then wrapped in clean linen that was changed each day for a week. Once for a period of several days when your gut rebelled against something in the water or the food, leaving you too weak for the ramps and assigned instead to carrying mud brick for ramp repair, a lighter task that felt humiliating for approximately one day, and then simply felt like work. Both times you were treated without particular ceremony, assessed given what the practitioners thought would help, and monitored until you were returned to the hauling roster. The system's interest in your recovery was genuine but instrumental. You were a unit of productive capacity, and productive capacity was to be maintained where possible. This is not cruelty. It is simply the logic of large-scale organized labor in a world that does not possess the conceptual vocabulary to frame it otherwise. The men who administer the food distribution, the medical care, the tool allocation, the work rosters, they are operating within a framework of state obligation and divine commission that encompasses both the monument being built and the human beings building it. The pharaoh's eternal house requires workers. Workers require sustenance and basic maintenance. Therefore, sustenance and basic maintenance are provided with the same administrative precision that governs every other element of the project. The workers are not invisible to the system. They are simply categorized within it differently than the architects, the master craftsmen, the scribes, the overseers. And yet within that categorization, ordinary human life continues with its own density and texture. Men form loyalties within their gangs that outlast the flood season and carry back to their home communities as stories. Rivalries develop between crews, overhauling speed over food distribution, over the minor hierarchies of who gets assigned the better ramp sections and who works the difficult angles. Men gamble with small stones in the evenings, playing games whose rules you learned in your first week here. Men get sick and recover and get sick again. Men dream, presumably, though dreams are not spoken about much in a community where sleep is primarily a physical necessity rather than a contemplative experience. The night deepens over the settlement. The fires reduce to coals. The lamplight in the administrative buildings goes dark in stages as the scribes complete their work and retire. The quarry percussion, which had continued at a reduced pace through the early evening, falls silent sometime in the middle hours of the night, leaving the plateau in a quiet that is not quite absolute. There is always the wind and the occasional sound of a restless animal from the livestock area, and the distant impression of the river felt more than heard, a low presence at the edge of perception. In the sleeping room, the other men are already down on their mats. The linen is pulled up against the chill. Breathing fills the small space again, slower now, the rhythm of genuine rest rather than the shallow alertness of early morning. The southern man's carved figure sits somewhere in the dark on the floor near the doorway, its patient posture unchanged, its limestone weight holding the coolness of the night air. Above the settlement, above the plateau's edge, the structure rises in the darkness with no need for light to confirm its presence. Its mass is simply there, a fact as absolute and indifferent as the desert temperature, as the river's seasonal will, as the slow movement of stars across the sky above Giza, that the priests read for meaning and the workers experienced simply as the reliable rotation of the night. You close your eyes. The ache in your shoulders is a familiar companion now, no longer alarming, simply present. Tomorrow the ramps will be wet with morning water. The bread will be warm and gritty. The rope will be rough in your hands. The block will move. There is a morning, somewhere in the final weeks of the flood season, when the change in the air is unmistakable. It arrives not as a single event, but as an accumulation of small signals that the body registers before the mind articulates them. The light is different, fractionally lower in its angle even at the same hour, the shadows slightly longer, the quality of warmth on your face carrying a hint of something that will eventually become autumn. The river, you have been told by the men who watch such things, has already begun its slow withdrawal from the peak. Back in the agricultural villages along the Nile, the water is pulling back from the fields, leaving behind the dark, wet sediment that makes the soil what it is, dense, mineral-rich, the gift of everything the river has carried down from the distant interior of the continent and deposited here, year after year, in the same patient transaction. The work continues regardless of what season is shifting in the air. The hauling crews are on the ramps before the sun fully clears the horizon, the rhythm of it as deep in your body now as breathing. But something has changed in the texture of the days. Men have begun to speak about the return, not obsessively, not with the desperation of people who have been suffering, but with the quiet anticipatory attention of people whose thoughts have begun, gradually and naturally, to move toward what comes next. The upriver man talks about his daughters with more frequency now, specific details surfacing in conversation that had not appeared before. The elder one's habit of singing while she works, the younger one's attachment to a particular goat that she has named and refuses to acknowledge as livestock. These details were presumably always present in his inner life. They surface now because the internal distance between here and home has begun to close. Your own thoughts move similarly, in the hours between hauls and in the early mornings before the settlement fully stirs. The fields you left behind beneath the floodwater are already, in imagination, beginning to emerge. Dark and glistening at first, then drying to the particular color of fertile Nile silt, the color that means the planting season is approaching, and the year's real work, the work that feeds your family rather than a monument, is about to begin. The two kinds of work are not entirely unlike each other in physical terms. Both demand sustained effort, both organize the body around a rhythm that becomes almost involuntary over time, both leave their marks in muscle and joint and the particular posture of a man accustomed to sustained labor. But one feeds those you know, and the other feeds something whose scale you cannot fully comprehend, and the emotional register of the two is not the same. On one of the final days before the seasonal release, you are assigned not to the hauling ropes, but to a section of the lower outer casing, specifically to the team that is preparing the surface of already placed casing stones for final dressing. This is not your usual work, and you are there to assist rather than to lead, handling tools and positioning wooden guides under the direction of a finishing mason who has been working this particular surface for weeks. The man is older than most of the workforce here, with forearms that carry the particular development of someone who has spent decades with mallet and chisel, the muscle built not in the broad way of the hauling crews, but in specific concentrated deposits around the wrist and along the inner forearm. He works slowly and without apparent urgency, making cuts so fine they are almost inaudible, a whisper of copper against limestone rather than the percussion of the quarry below. He is not removing material so much as revealing a surface that he seems to believe already exists within the stone, his hands finding it the way water finds the lowest point in a landscape. You watch him between your own tasks, the holding and the guiding and the careful placement of the wooden straight edge against the dressed face. At one point, he runs his thumb across a section he has just finished and makes a sound, not a word, simply a low sound of assessment, and then makes 3 additional cuts, so small you cannot see their effect until he steps back slightly, and the raking light from the west shows you the difference. The surface now reading as continuous and true, where before there had been an almost imperceptible irregularity. This is the other face of the construction, the one that the hauling crews rarely encounter directly. The monument is not only mass and logistics, it is also this: a man's thumb reading a surface for truth, a copper chisel finding a plane that will catch the Egyptian sun for longer than either of you can imagine. The outer casing, when complete, will be so precisely finished and so tightly jointed that the seams between individual stones will be nearly invisible from any practical distance. The men who conceived this understood that a surface seen from across the desert had to function differently than one examined at arm's length, and they solved this problem not through compromise, but through exactness, making the close examination and the distant view equally true. In the final days of your season at Giza, the site takes on a quality that is difficult to name precisely. The urgency of the daily haul is still present, but there is layered beneath it now a kind of valedictory attention, men looking at what they have contributed to in the way that people look at things they are about to leave. You find yourself pausing on the ramp's descent to look upward at the courses above you, tracing the line from the bedrock foundation to the current working level with a gaze that is different from the functional upward glance of a man assessing his next haul. You are trying to see it whole, to take something of it with you that will survive the journey back upriver and the return to the fields and the ordinary human scale of your life there. What you find looking at it this way is not transcendence exactly, but something more durable than awe. It is a recognition, quiet, physical, grounded in the specific knowledge of your own body's contribution, that you were part of something whose terms you did not set, and whose full meaning you cannot access, but whose existence is now inseparably entangled with your own. The rope calluses on your palms are evidence of it. The slight asymmetry that has developed in your left shoulder is evidence of it. The sound of the cadence call that you will hear in your own head on certain mornings for the rest of your life, surfacing without invitation from wherever the body stores the rhythms it has lived through. That, too, is evidence of it. The release from the seasonal labor comes on a morning that is like other mornings in its mechanics. Bread and beer, the gathering of gangs, the administrative process of recording departures against the same rosters that recorded arrivals months before. But it has the particular quality of transitions that have been anticipated long enough to arrive finally with a kind of deflation alongside the relief. You shoulder the small bundle of your belongings. You walk with your gang through the settlement's organized pathways for the last time, past the bakeries and the storage magazines, and the medical facility, and the administrative buildings where the lamps burned through the night. Other gangs are departing simultaneously, the paths briefly dense with moving men, voices in multiple dialects, the general sound of a large temporary community disassembling. At the edge of the settlement, you pause and look back once toward the plateau. The monument is visible above the settlement's roofline, its upper courses catching the early sun, the dressed casing on the lower sections throwing back a brightness that is almost liquid in quality. The work on it will continue through other seasons, with other crews, other men from other villages arriving as you and yours depart. The structure does not pause. It has no relationship to individual seasons or individual bodies. It is simply becoming what it will become, incrementally, through the accumulation of exactly this departure, repeated across many flood seasons, many gangs, many thousands of men who carried their contribution up the ramp and left it there and walked back to their lives. You turn and walk toward the river. The boat that will carry you upriver is already loading at the canal's edge, other men settling their weight along the wooden hull, the vessel sitting lower in the water as it fills. The Nile beyond the canal is visible in the distance, its surface wide and light-scattered in the morning sun, carrying the last of the season's flood color, that particular brown gold of high water beginning its recession, dense with the silt that will become next season's fields. The river looks the same as it always has. It will look the same long after the monument above you has received its final casing stone and the architects have confirmed its apex, and the pharaoh's name has been written in whatever permanent form permanence takes in this world. What remains of these lives now is mostly silence, the silence of ordinary people who built extraordinary things and then went home and planted their fields and raised their children and died in the fullness of time without leaving their names in any record that survived. The monument survived. The administrative papyri survived in fragments. The workers' village survived as buried archaeology, yielding its evidence slowly to careful excavation. But the individual experience of it, the specific weight of the rope, the smell of the bread, the sound of the cadence call across the plateau in the early morning, that lived only in the bodies that carried it, and those bodies are long returned to the same earth they once helped to cut and dress and raise. History is full of such silences, and it is in sitting with those silences, in trying to hear what ordinary life actually sounded like before it was abstracted into monuments and records and the broad strokes of significance, that something essential about the human past becomes briefly audible. That is what Another POV is here to do, to return again and again to the ground level of history, where the bread is gritty and the rope is rough, and the work is simply the work, and the people doing it are people fully and without reduction. If that kind of perspective is one you want to carry with you, we will be here with another story whenever you are ready to return.